let's get started. Professor Kleiman and I will talk till about 6, and then we'll take questions. What we've done in the past that seems to work well is we'll pass out some index cards. You can write questions down, and someone will pass them up here. If you're on Twitter, our handle is at NYU Stern UP for Urbanization Project, and I guess there is a special hashtag Kleiman Romer for this evening. So
I don't know if I'm a special hashtag. Have I arrived?
Yeah. Mark, you have already arrived. Right. For those of you who don't know Mark, he's I think the most creative mind thinking about public safety and criminal justice in the United States right now. He has there's a kind of a, what should I call it, a piece about you in the New Yorker. Yes. It's not quite a bio, but a piece about you in the New Yorker that focuses on your most recent stuff on drug and cannabis legalization in particular. But I think when you have a piece all about you in the New Yorker, you've already arrived.
I suppose that's right.
Maybe I'm too old school.
Exactly.
And rate the New Yorker too highly relative to Twitter, but I think so. So I wanted to start just by getting you to retell the story of kind of calculations about what's the rate of return to burglary that you gave in the paper that we've published, and then also use that as a kind of a springboard to how did you get into thinking about crime as a public policy issue?
All right, so this is a story that reflects both what you can do with quick calculations and how you can get them wrong. So here's the puzzle. How come we have so much crime in this country?
And this is when?
I'm thinking about this in 1979, when I had just gone to work for the Justice Department, running the policy analysis shop for the criminal division. A job I took not because I was particularly interested in criminal justice, but because Phil Hyman was running the place, and he's a great man. And I was told as a freshman to take professors, not courses. So that's what I did. And at that point, the U.S. had something like twice the crime rate of any European country. The good news is we've caught up. The bad news is not because our crime is lower. European crime rose about 10 years behind ours. And people don't know this, but your car is actually more likely to be stolen in Stockholm than in Detroit. We're still extraordinary on very serious violent crime. So we still have 4 times the homicide rate of Europe or Canada. But the rest of crime were, but back then we were high. And we were also pretty high on incarceration. And so there were a lot of argument about why we're high on incarceration. And so I said, well, are we high on incarceration compared to population? Or are we still high on incarceration compared to crime? Presumably the measure of punitiveness is punishment per crime, not punishment total. And when we did the arithmetic that way, we were actually less punitive than Europe back then. So then, when I was thinking about, cannabis back then, thinking about, well, how much we'd have to expand cannabis enforcement to keep the prices from falling. And that got into sort of frightening numbers of people behind bars. So my first hint that drug law enforcement might mostly be a waste of time. I mean, the good news, the thing about predatory crime enforcement is if I lock up a burglar, the least I've done is prevented the burglaries that he would have committed.
Right.
Because nobody's going to commit his burglaries for him. He wasn't waiting in line between 6 other burglars to wait for an, I mean, apartments aren't scarce.
So we can count on an incarceration effect, even if we don't know if there's a deterrent effect.
Right, and if there's a deterrent effect, it's real because we've actually deterred whoever we deterred. Nobody's doing those burglaries either, unless you think there's some risk compensation by homeowners having fewer locks on their doors. On the other hand, if you lock up a dope dealer, you're simply creating a niche for another dope dealer. The scarce factor in dope dealing is not people willing to make money selling dope. It's customers. And in fact, there was a paper a couple years later showing that most crack dealers were underemployed. They worked Friday night and Saturday night, but Tuesday afternoon, there wasn't enough work to support a dealer in a corner. So that's sort of the hint that drug enforcement's a different arithmetic and we should mostly stop doing it. Yeah. But then I turned back and said, okay, well, how about ordinary Part 1 predatory crime? How punitive are we about burglary? All right, well, I know how many prisoners there are. There's a survey every few years looking at the prisoners and what they're in for. So if I multiply whatever the number was back then by, I don't know, 22%, that's the number of burglary prisoners. Times 365 is days of incarceration served for burglary per year, divided by, divided by the number of burglaries is days per burglary. 6. 6 days is the average sanction for burglary. Now, of course, nobody actually gets 6 days. Most people get nothing, and a few people get 2 years. But, you know, I'd read Jim Wilson's Thinking About Crime and said, I didn't like it. I mean, that wasn't the answer I wanted. But I looked at these numbers and said, you know, he's right. Right? We have too much crime because we don't punish it. And why should we bother hiring more cops when the cops are already arresting more people than the courts can process? And the courts are already sentencing more people than the prison's going to hold. Right? You can't, if you got a problem that your tuna fish is piling up on the dock because you don't have enough cannery capacity, hiring more boats has got to be the wrong way to go. So that was my argument, that we had to get some more punishment capacity online to get the price of crime to some reasonable level. It wasn't until a bunch of years later that I did the other half of the calculation. So if you're a burglar, what's your gain from committing a burglary? Well, at most, it's whatever the homeowner lost. Most police departments will ask the homeowner for a valuation on the goods lost in the burglary. That, of course, is what's going to the insurance department company. So I have a feeling these are not underestimates. And if you do total burglaries, you have to add the ones that aren't reported to the police, and then again, those are likely to be lower value burglaries. Still in all, what the FBI was reporting back then was $1,200. I forget whether that was the mean or the median loss from a burglary. Mm-hmm. Well, but that's not what the burglar gets, right? The cash is cash, and the guns are probably worth more than face value. Everything else might be worth 10%. I mean, what's a stolen TV set worth? So, not doing very precise calculations, it looked to me like that burglar was taking about $250 for 6 days. $40 for 24 hours behind bars. That's $2 an hour. McDonald's pays better. So the original calculation was wrong because I'd only done the cost side of a cost-benefit calculation from the burglar's point of view. So now you had the opposite puzzle. Because there aren't many people who, if you said, you know, if you'll go to jail for a day, I'll give you $40 on the way out the door. Right? That's just not an attractive deal to most people. So how come people are doing it anyway? And by the street dope dealing is worse in terms of a business proposition. And I think the answer has to be that the benefits of the burglary are right away and reasonably certain, and the costs are deferred and uncertain. And basically, this is a behavioral economics problem. Right. So the James Q. Wilson question, how can we make crime not pay? The answer is we already do. Crime already doesn't pay for any reason. And I'm not talking about whether people have good opportunities or not. If your alternative is to pick up soda cans on the street and return them for deposit, you can make more money than that. So part of it is, and this is Jack Katz's point, that there are people who would feel disgraced picking up soda cans and do not feel disgraced supporting themselves as burglars. Right? So that's one set of questions. But the other thing it still seems to me is, well, so now we've got to figure out how to make the punishments more swift and certain rather than more severe, right? So this calculation tells you would have told you that ratcheting up the prison population wasn't likely to have much benefit, and indeed we did, and indeed it didn't.
But so the part of the premise in the calculation was one from the kind of the economic analysis of crime. The cost of committing a crime is something like the punishment or the probability of punishment times the severity of the punishment. So probability of getting arrested times, say, the number of days you'll serve, and so you come up with a number like on average 6 days per burglary.
Right. And that's essentially the calculation in Gary Becker's famous economics of crime paper, which is brilliant and completely wrong.
And if anything, the usual economic analysis would say, well, you throw some risk into this, that should make it even more punitive. So, you know, as a kind of a simplifying assumption, no harm in just assuming it's the product. And where you went was to say this is completely wrong, and that holding constant the probability of arrest times the sentence length, you go the other direction and make the probability much higher and the sentence much lower, you could get a completely different outcome.
Right. And one way to think about that, I mean, that was already written down by Cesare Beccaria in 1745 in a book called On Crimes and Punishments, where he says, look, there are 3 factors about a punishment that determine its efficacy: swiftness, certainty, and severity.
Okay, so those phrases come from
him. That's the Italian school. This is the invention of criminology, and Beccaria does sort of a hand-waving psychological argument to say that severity isn't going to matter very much. I mean, he's basically arguing against torture and capital punishment back then. So that sits there as a proposition that all criminologists recite to each other, and is completely inconsistent with economic analysis. Right. So now along come Kahneman and Tversky, right? And the combination of hyperbolic discount and Ainsley, combination of hyperbolic discounting and prospect theory puts a theoretical basis under Beccaria, and therefore we know that he's right and Becker's wrong. That was an expensive lesson to learn. We could have learned it more cheaply on a blackboard than by building 2.5 million prison cells. Right.
So when did you do the second calculation about what's the return, the economic return to burglary, and where was that relative to, say, the work on like Project Hope? I'm just kind of curious about the evolution in your.
So the second calculation gets done in the early 90s, but the swift, certain, fair idea actually comes from a completely different angle.
Okay.
So here's how that comes. We've got a lot of offenders who are heavy drug users. And they're mostly committing crimes not because they're under the influence, except for alcohol, but that's the big one. Most of the other drugs, the issue is just getting the money to support the habit. And then, of course, there's crime that comes from the illicit market and the violence around that. Right. But if you got somebody who's a heroin-using burglar, is the way I started thinking about this, there's obviously a win-win if he stops using heroin. And again, heroin use has the same reward structure, right? It's fun right now and it's bad in the long run. So there's an idea that had been around for a long time. If you've got somebody who's a drug-using property offender, make him a deal. Say, hey, go to drug treatment and we won't punish you for your latest burglary. And that's obviously a good deal all around. If he goes to treatment and stops using, then he might stop committing burglaries. Most people who use illicit drugs don't do anything else that's wrong. But people who use enough drugs you need to commit crime to support their habit don't stop using, don't stop stealing unless they stop using. So that's what got you task and drug diversion and eventually drug courts. And that's the line of thinking that leads to coerced treatment programs, the treatment mandates in the criminal justice system. And it turns out to be a really ineffective system because, in part because, we don't have swift and certain sanctions for breaking the rules, right? So in California, Prop 36, which is the biggest and best studied of those, 12.5% of the people who took the deal to get treatment instead of going to prison never showed up for their treatment needs assessment. 12.5% of the rest never showed up for their first treatment appointment. Mm-hmm. So of the 3/4 who ever went to treatment, 2/3 dropped out before their treatment course was complete. So 25% actually did what they were supposed to do. Right. And you know what happened to the rest? Nothing. Because after all, you're a busy probation officer. All the guy did was not go to drug treatment. I mean, who cares? Right? So that turns out not to be a great way to deal with drug-involved offenders, though we keep trying. And it occurred to me the alternative way to do it, since you can do drug testing, is mandate the end and not the means. Mm-hmm. Say, look, you can stop using drugs any way you like, and there's treatment available if you want it, but you have to stop using. Mm-hmm. And if you use, we'll put you back inside. This was not on a swift and certain idea. This was just, let's use this to triage the users.
Yeah. Okay. Right? But also just to make this deal of treatment instead of punishment real.
But also, the worst you were going to get was to make the people who were going to keep committing burglaries self-select visibly and quickly, so you can put them back in, stop getting the burglaries, and because those guys are a small minority of drug users, but most of the drug market in revenue terms, mm-hmm. This is a much more effective way of squeezing down on drug dealing than arresting dealers. So anything that reduces demand has huge advantages over anything that reduces supply. But when you say reducing demand, people think about facilitative interventions, prevention and treatment. Hmm. They don't think about coercive means of reducing demand, unless they have really twisted minds like mine. So that's what I was thinking about. All right, so then you think about how to do that program, and you've already got in the back of your mind that this swift and certain thing actually matters. So could you give a very mild sanction the first time? Mm-hmm. And there had been some of that in the world. So DC pretrial in the 70s was doing this for pretrial releasees. Okay. And getting very good results. And then they stopped doing it.
Some randomized testing of people?
I think they're actually doing scheduled testing.
Okay.
I mean, the reason to randomize the test is you don't want to create a window for undetected use. Yeah. The other way to do it is just to test the guy on Tuesdays and Fridays. There's not enough window left for undetected use to matter. Yeah. And it's a matter of convenience. Or the other thing, you can use a hair test or a sweat patch, which will give you a week at a time.
But with like in DC, if you tested positive, then what did they do?
Revoke the bail.
Okay.
So anyway, they stopped doing that after a while. There's a thing in Lansing, Michigan called Project Sentry that did this and had good success with it. And I started writing papers about it. And then, as far as I can tell, completely independent of anything I'd said or done, a judge in Hawaii named Steve who'd been the U.S. attorney, got on the state trial court bench, inherits a probation caseload, because in Hawaii the judge keeps the probation case. And the probation officers start bringing him revocation motions. And he looks at the file, and the guys had 12 scheduled drug tests in the last year, and he missed 3 of them and was dirty for 6 of them. Yeah. And the PO says, okay, I want to revoke this guy. And the judge said to them, okay, I see why you want me to revoke this guy. He's clearly not getting the message. What I don't see is why I'm getting the case when it's hopeless. Right? If this is his 9th violation, what did you do the first 8 times? Yeah. And so now we go from
if he did revoke at that point, the implied sentence for taking the drugs is
5 years.
5 years. Yeah.
If he goes back to prison in principle to fill the full term, though that can be modified in various ways. It was crazy. And so of course he didn't want to do that, and of course the POs didn't want to ask him to do that, and so they ignored most violations. And since they ignored most violations, people kept violating because nobody ever knew which violation was going to trigger the disaster. Yeah. So now we've moved from the behavioral economics of this to the pure game theory of it. Right? High violation, low sanction is a stable equilibrium. Because the high violation rate supports the low sanction rate, you can't sanction everybody. And so when the judge said to the POs, look, I want to hear about the first violation, they said, Your Honor, we have caseloads of 150 or 180. 10% don't show up and 20% show up dirty every month. 0.3 times 180 is 54. It takes 4 hours to write up a violation notice, right? We can't do what you want done, so we have to do it the way we do it, which is we work with the guy, we warn him, we threaten him, and if eventually he doesn't get the message, we bring him to you.
But let me just stop for a second, because I think this is really important in this story, because the old view, or I think implicit view, was that we don't find people who commit crimes very often. It's very hard to detect. So we're only going to punish a few people because we just don't know who the other guys are.
And therefore you can ramp it up.
The only way to make the expected cost high is to really whack the guy who, you know, the few that we caught. Right. So I think that's the implicit model lots of people have about why we have to have very high punishments for the few we catch.
This is Justice Cook's argument for why you need capital punishment for horse stealing.
Yeah.
Because you almost never find a horse thief.
Yeah. And like why you traditional punishments, like, you know, cut somebody's hand off when you catch them for burglary. But when you look in detail at something like the probation system, what you see is there's no problem detecting all of these violations, but if you're given this very high punishment, there's no way you can actually deliver punishment on that scale, because partly you don't have the jail capacity or the prison capacity, but you don't have the processing capacity too, because it's, you have to have
even if you had all of that, do you really want the guy in prison for 5 years, either from his point of view or from yours? No.
But I mean, even some people who might not be persuaded on that point, it's like kind of like we want them all in prison. You know, they got to understand that one, there's a capacity constraint in the jails, but two, the procedural requirements when what's at stake is five years of punishment are completely different than the procedural requirements. Like you know, the equal fair treatment by the legal system's got to be completely different and inherently much more slow and cautious.
So this is one of the most brilliant insights I ever had, which is Beccaria was right but didn't go far enough. It's not just that severity is an inadequate substitute for swiftness and certainty. Severity is the enemy of swiftness and certainty. The more severe a punishment, the less consistently you can do it, and the more due process you need, and therefore the more slowly you do it. And that was not a less brilliant insight when I reread Thinking About Crime and discovered that Jim Wilson had said it. And I just sort of filed the serial number off and put it in my pocket.
Well, you know, it just invoked great minds think alike. You know?
Something. No, I'd actually read the book, so I just I can just invoke forgetfulness. So anyway, so the judge said, I want the first violation, and the PO said, Your Honor, because he said, look, I understand this argument, but if you look at it from the offender's point of view, you wouldn't raise your kid that way. You wouldn't train a puppy that way. I want the first violation. And they said, Your Honor, is there some part of impossible you'd like us to explain more slowly? We just showed you the arithmetic. We can't do that. So Alm said, all right.
But again, and here what matters is that they're responding under the assumption that there's no change in the quantity of violations. But you know, the judge may be correctly anticipating that if you're much more likely to get these small punishments, the number of violations these guys are going to have to process goes down, and they're going to be able to process them much more quickly.
But this is, well, two things. This is an alligators in the swamp problem. Yes, if you could have adequate amount of punishment for a while, right? So that's the dynamic concentration. But an individual PO can't actually do that. There's just no way that person can create that condition unless you're going to put 4 POs on that caseload. The other issue, they were assuming correctly that they had no capacity to change the paperwork. But the judge said, wait a minute, why does it take 4 hours to write up a violation? Well, you're documenting 9 violations stretching out over the last year, and the defense lawyer is going to be fighting every single one, wanting to make sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, because his guy's looking at prison time. And Alm said, but wait a minute. If what you're reporting is the guy tested positive for methamphetamine yesterday, that doesn't really require a lot of prose. And if what's at stake is 2 nights in jail, that doesn't require a lot of process. So they simplified the process, but the other thing they did was they concentrated. So the judge said to the POs, look, I'll compromise with you. Give me the list of people that you would bring to me for revocation on their next violation. People really have had their last chance. Now, here's my belief. I don't think such a list actually existed until he called for it.
Yeah.
I think the POs were making that decision on the spot. I think the probationers knew that the POs were making that decision on the spot. Therefore, there was never any certainty. Because how are you supposed to tell whether the third time the PO said to you, okay, this is your last chance,
Right.
it's really your last chance. So the judge said, bring me a list of the people that you bring me next time for violation. Takes those 35 people, brings them into court, and holds what he calls a warning hearing, which is a brand new process he just invented.
Yep.
Being judges, what a great racket. So he invents this new process called a warning hearing, which is basically reading the Riot Act and promising them that they're going to be randomly tested and that every time they break a rule, they're going to spend some time in jail.
Yeah. And we can come back to this, but this has echoes of the kind of stuff that David Kennedy was thinking about with directing this focused threat of punishment on a narrow group of gang offenders.
Right. Well, this is no accident, comrades, since David and I were at adjacent desks at the Kennedy School when he was working on his stuff and I was working on my stuff. Right. So yes, it was the same thinking, two very different domains.
And does Wilson get credit for this one too, or you guys were just channeling?
No, there's not. I mean, the swiftness and certainty idea is certainly in Wilson, but this application of it, and the thing that's really not in Wilson, and I have to say this is more David and Steve Alm than it is me, because I'm not a people person. It turns out that the objective threat is relatively unimportant compared to the subjective threat. And just having the risk out there in the world and hoping the offenders notice it is not really a very good strategy. So again, if you think about this in game theoretic terms, in a zero-sum game, there's never an incentive to give your opponent accurate information. In a non-zero-sum game, it's frequently the case that you want to tell your opponent what's happening to get the response that's mutually beneficial. This is such a case. And so both for that reason and for reasons of perceived fairness, and that was the piece that I completely left out that David got, which is the efficacy of a punishment doesn't have to just to do with its swiftness and certainty. It has to do with whether it comes from a process that looks legitimate to the person being punished. And Justice Holmes said that even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. And, you know, probation punishment is much too much like being stumbled over. And if there's been a direct warning, then the onus, in the offender's eyes, is on the offender. And so the notion of a directly communicated threat turns out to be central here. And the swiftness and certainty matter in part, you know, for sort of behavioral economics reasons, but partly because the punishment is swift and certain, it looks fair. And the fact that these things keep working after you stop administering the punishments says you're not just doing deterrence here. I mean, I thought of this as an advance in deterrence theory, and that was a completely inadequate way to think about it.
So run that by me again. So why can you tell this is more than just deterrence?
Because if you say to somebody, look, every time you use, you're going to go to jail for 2 days. Yep. And swiftness and certainty works, and you can actually make that happen, and he believes it, then you're going to reduce his drug use. Right. The day you stop testing him, if all you were doing was deterrence, he's going to go back. In fact, this has lasting effects. And now, part of that is just habituation, right?
I mean, but you could have a kind of a broader model that I mean, it is deterrence in the sense that you're preventing people from committing crimes, but it's both kind of the immediate deterrence now and the immediate consequence now, and possibly some more lasting kind of changes.
But also it turns out, and this is the stuff that Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler have been working on. People, just about universally, resist knuckling under to illegitimate authority. If it looks like you're being punished arbitrarily or unfairly or singled out for punishment, people will keep offending just to frustrate the punisher. If the system appears to be sensible and predictable and fair, then it's not disgraceful to comply with it.
Yeah, you know, John.
Or a different way to think about it is, the first account I gave took the impulsivity and short-termness and recklessness of this group as a fact, and asks, how can you change the punishment to make it more effective for a group with those characteristics?
Right.
The other question you can ask is there something you could do to make people better self-controlled? Yeah. And the answer may be swift and certain punishment. Right. Because if the problem with crime and drug abuse is a time mismatch problem, that the benefits are too close and the costs are too distant. Somebody once said that if the hangover came before the binge,
yeah, drinking
would be a virtue.
Yeah.
So if you can get the time mismatch right, you can actually help people establish self-command. And it turns out that having people establish self-command is the central objective here.
Yeah. Well, so it could surely be partly a function of self-control and self-command, but there may be these other dimensions too. Like, you know, Jonathan Haidt has this notion of our moral systems have these dimensions, one of which is a general tendency to respect authority, but another is this tendency to rebel and resist against oppression. And so that, you know, how somebody perceives authority as being legitimate and something you respect, or oppressive and something that you resist, could be an important characteristic of that individual at a point in time, but it might be something that is determined by experience and is malleable. It's not like something that can never be changed.
So now here's what I think is deeply paradoxical but true. The therapeutic turn in corrections, where you encourage judges and probation officers to exercise clinical judgment, to establish interpersonal relationships, to work directly with the offender, can have a very bad consequence. Because once you've done that, so the guy's been behaving well for 6 weeks and screws up, a very strong impulse in the probation officer to say, okay, Joe, you know you weren't supposed to do that, right? And you won't do it again, right? All right, you're a good guy. I'm going to give you a pass this time. I claim that that is completely toxic. Yeah. Because from then on, every punishment is discretionary in the probation officer and therefore resented. If the punishment arrives every time, then the punishment is simply the consequence of the behavior and will be internalized rather than being resented. And I think we now, that's what the probationers in Hawaii were telling us. Yeah. We don't have enough evidence for that yet, but I'm a pretty strong believer. There's a I forget who sent me out. It was a blog post on animal training. I'm not a pet person, and it was a woman who had a big dog, and she wrote into this famous animal guy and said, look, I got a problem. The dog pulls on the leash, and I pull back. And he pulls, and I pull back, and he pulls. But he's big, and eventually, sometimes I just get tired and give up. And so he keeps pulling, because she was aware of what was going on. And the trainer said, if you tie the leash to a tree, does the dog keep pulling? Well, no, of course not. He knows the tree's not going to give up. Trainer says, be the tree. Right. But think how hard this is for a clinically trained probation officer to say, no, I have to give up my discretion. I have to do the same thing every time.
Yeah. But this is a much broader
It's just
point.
good parenting.
But think about what this means for the officer in New York City when he gets the message, or he or she gets a message that he should enforce jaywalking, at least sometimes. We're giving them this mandate to reduce fatalities, to enforce the rules against jaywalking in some circumstances, but it's very opaque what those circumstances are. It looks to somebody like it's completely at the discretion of the officer, because lots of people will not be getting tickets and crossing the street. Somebody does. And then think of a situation where there's somebody who does, maybe for very good objective reasons, turns out to be black. Watch a bunch of people who are white who are not getting tickets for clearly violating the law, and then think about what this does for the legitimacy of the whole the whole system.
And so I certainly would have wanted somebody to ask me about jaywalking enforcement. And look, I'm I've been in Los Angeles long enough to appreciate the fact
Yeah.
that mostly pedestrians don't jaywalk and mostly drivers don't try to kill them, unlike on both sides of that in New York. And I think if it were possible to make New York more Los Angeles, like in the way cars and pedestrians interact, that would be a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But whatever outcome we agree on there, it's just crazy to say we're going to make something against the law and then tell the police to mostly not enforce that law, but to sometimes enforce it.
Well, or one way to do it would be to say, to take ID and hand out a warning, unless when you run the record check, the guy's already had his warning.
Yeah. But like in New York, it's just a non-starter to, you could talk to Giuliani about this. It's a non-starter to say, well, we're actually going to start enforcing, jaywalking like LA. But what you could do is do something like codify what I think is the generally accepted norm here, which is that what you don't do is cross against the light when you're going to impede the flow of traffic.
Right.
So you could make it just the law that if you cross against the light and impede the flow of traffic, you'll get a ticket. But if you cross against the light when there's no oncoming traffic, it's at your own risk.
Right.
We're not going to, it's not going to be our fault if you get hit. But at least if you think you're crossing against the light when you don't impede traffic, we're not going to ticket that. So we could write laws that conform to what people think is the right thing to do, and then the police would have a much simpler job.
I think that's right. I would go after horn blowing before I went after jaywalking.
Yeah. But so I mean, back just in case people hadn't heard the end of the Hope story. So the judge,
So he warns
says,
these 35 people. Look, every time you screw up, you're going to go to jail. And since the screw up rate was roughly 1 in 30%, and since these people are now coming in for a test 6 times a month instead of once a month, and random rather than scheduled, he braced himself for a lot of hearings.
Yeah.
I didn't get him. First week he had 3 hearings. The next week he had 1 hearing. More than half of those, 17 out of 35 of those people never broke a rule over the next year.
Yeah.
Because it turned out when the consequence was clear and immediate, people fell into line. And, Hawken eventually ran a big randomized controlled trial.
So Angela Hawken
at Pepperdine.
Your co-author, yeah.
Who's an actual social scientist. Ran a real randomized controlled trial, 500 experimentals, 300 controls, plenty powered. If you call the following thing success, at 1 year from program entry, the person is in compliance, has not absconded, has not committed a new crime, has not had a positive drug test in the last 3 months. Call that success. 80% were successful. Of a group that was anti-cherry picked, that was picked for the program because they had been persistently non-compliant.
Yeah.
Now, there's no drug treatment program in the world that can get 80% of a population of heavy meth users clean.
Yeah.
And it has been astonishing.
Or no other,
Right.
There's no traditional drug program. Yeah.
It has been astonishing to watch the drug treatment research world resist this result.
Right.
But I pitched this to Alan Leshner, who was the director of the National Center on Drug Abuse before it started in Hawaii. This was about '93, and I said, "Look, here's what I do." And Leshner said, "No, you don't understand. Drug abuse is a chronic relapsing brain disorder, and therefore I know that your program wouldn't work."
Right.
And I said, "Well, but there's this other set of theories that discuss it would work. How about doing an experiment?" And he said that would be unethical. I know these people have a disease. It would be unethical to do the experiment. So no, there's no way the National Institute on Drug Abuse is going to fund this. And the empire has fought back pretty successfully.
Yeah. But let's the
notion that supervision could be more therapeutic than treatment
Yeah.
is too radical to be an easy swallow. Yeah. And by that, it's not just true of drugs, right? We've got this whole industry of providing mandated services to offenders. And I think we should start mandating
which is
outcomes.
Perverse if you think that something like self-command is the key thing here.
Exactly.
But instead of having the therapeutic professionals who kind of fix the person, you just create an incentive for the person to fix themselves. It may be a much better.
But also you've created a therapeutic enmity rather than a therapeutic alliance by making the therapist's attention part of the punishment. On the other hand, in Hope, when somebody's finally mandated a treatment, it's succeed or go to prison. the treatment people in Hawaii love the program because it sends them people who actually want to succeed, as opposed to their usual criminal justice referrals, who say, all right, well, the judge said I had to be here, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about kind of why these ideas have been slow to spread. I think one is people are slow to change these mindsets about, you know, basically these very strong individual effects rather than a kind of a general responsiveness. But there's also, and by the way, economists have become some of the worst offenders there. We used to be the people who believed that individuals respond to incentives. Now the economics of crime seems entirely all about types. It's just they're types, you figure out who the types are and hammer the bad guys.
Right.
And I don't know why economists have kind of fallen off the bandwagon about, you know, incentives.
So I think I know the answer, or at least part of the answer, which is there is just a ton of research looking for deterrent effects.
Yeah.
And mostly not finding it. And, you know, my view on that is that if you'd studied aviation by looking at lead balloons, you might have concluded that flight is not possible.
Right.
And so I think the conclusion punishment doesn't work has been drawn. It's a mantra in criminology.
Yeah.
The correct formulation is that ill-designed punishment doesn't work. There's so little well-designed punishment in the world that it's hard to tell. But and the result is that when there's a just came out a paper in Federal Probation, which is a leading journal in community corrections. 3 practitioners of the risk needs assessment approach, saying, you know, yes, we've got this 500-person randomized controlled trial, but don't believe those results because we know punishment doesn't work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but so I think
so that's part of it. But the other part of it, and I really have to raise my hand here.
Okay.
Those of us who said in 1976, 79, 80, we don't have enough prisons, helped to generate one of the worst decisions in American history. We probably could actually use the first 300,000 or 400,000 new spaces we built. The next million or so we built on top of that were really a bad idea. And so part of what happens is that the people pushing treatment, right? Treatment was what they were pushing instead of punishment. And so anytime you mention punishment, they think about building more prisons. And they, not completely unreasonably, distrust the corrections business with its apparently infinite appetite for people to lock up, right? I mean, between 1979 and 2010, the crime rate went down 50% and the incarceration went up 50%. We kept locking more and more people up, even when they weren't committing crimes. And so that's, I think a lot of the people who oppose these ideas just regard them as one more shuck and jive by the punishment industry. Yeah, yeah. But I think I like your, you know, your version of this, which is that, well, what we've shown is that if you do punishment badly, it doesn't deter. Right. But that doesn't rule out the possibility you do it well, it can. But I think implicit in that is that this awareness, there are a lot of ways to do punishment badly, and a lot more than, say, the simple probability times punishment kind of economic approach suggested. Now, if you thought about child rearing, this should have been obvious to us. Right. Because, you know, there's a lot of ways to punish kids, like to beat kids, to abuse them, that clearly don't have the kind of effects you want in terms of encouraging certain kinds of behavior. But I think we somehow didn't realize that most of the punishments we were evaluating were more like, you know, child abuse rather than good parenting. Exactly. We needed to invent, we still need to invent the criminal justice timeout. Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Well, the weekend in jail in Project Hope's pretty close to a timeout. Well, and so now the question is, could we make it a weekend at home? Yeah. Could we make it a week on a 9 p.m. curfew? But we're still looking for the minimum effective dose. Yeah. But I want to come back to the other side of this, which is so. Let me just say, when states start adopting the swift, certain, fair proposals, if it gets done by the legislature, they're likely to write a 30-day initial stay in as the first punishment, right? So the appetite for over-punishing is indeed very strong. Yeah, yeah. But there's this other side that I think we have to acknowledge, which is basically, I think, the story of the stoplight cameras. So I think there's a side, even people who understand the whole point about there's better ways to punish and blah, blah, blah.
they're worried that just by making it possible for the system to punish people more, especially if it can take the form of fines, which again, economists said it's a much better way to punish. Just make it a fine.
Right.
So the technology now for monitoring these very small violations of the rules on stoplights has led to this profit opportunity for a for-profit equipment supplier, and then all of these jurisdictions, and apparently now jurisdictions that are even like monkeying with the yellow light timing to increase the number of red light violations so they get more revenue. So instead of using the cameras to save lives at intersections, which we could have done,
you're going to make money. Right?
We're now actually doing things like shortening the yellow lights that can lead to more collisions and deaths, but generating some extra revenue.
Right, and of course, if you'd done this analysis, you would have said, why is a illegal turn at a red light so heavily punished? Right. I mean, if you think about it. Yeah. It's going to cost you $1,000 between the fine and what it does to your insurance rates and your required this, that, and the other thing. Pretty heavy penalty for a relatively an offense that's mostly not going to do anybody any harm. And the answer is the horse thief answer. Yeah. We almost never catch anybody for a red light violation or for speeding, right. And therefore we have to punish the hell out of them when we do. I would put in red light cameras and make the violation, the fine for red light, $10. Yeah. If you actually,
with the first one being a warning, where there's no fine at all.
Look, if it's $10, it's like a parking. I mean, it's actually less than a parking ticket. Yeah. People can put up with that. Right. The first time they get it, they won't do it again. And but there are very few people who actually would pay $10 for the privilege of saving those 3 seconds.
Yeah. But it turns on its head the notion from economists that basically a fine, which is a transfer, is a good kind of punishment compared to something which is actually, produces a net reduction in total social value. Again, but if you think about the response of the bureaucratic, judicial, political system, you may actually want to start by saying, if we're going to go to a lot of these timeouts and small punishments, maybe we should just make it illegal to make these fines. That if you're going to punish small violations, punish them in a way where somebody's got to go to jail over the weekend, but the jurisdiction pays a penalty for running the prison, and the prisoner pays a penalty for being locked up.
If we were punishing mostly people with resources, fines wouldn't be such a bad idea. The problem is if you're punishing people who are already poor. Yeah. You want penalties to make it easier, not harder, for people to integrate. And fines are just but your point's a different point.
The social costs are clearly, really serious for the poor, but you create some incredibly bad incentives on the government side if they see fines as a big revenue opportunity.
This too was written down in 1517. Yeah. It's in the Prince.
Interesting.
He says, keep your hands off your subjects' money. Yeah. Yeah. Don't use fines as a means of punishment, because you'll be a little bit reluctant to shed blood. But once you start taking money, you'll always be finding an excuse to take money. Yeah. No, it's completely right. And that's actually raises a different set of questions, which is the economist's view of this treats the official as a mere mechanism. Mm-hmm. And that's an error, right? And so when you get into the capital punishment discussion, I can make out a reasonable case for capital punishment. And in fact, John Stuart Mill did. He said, look, death isn't nearly as bad as people think it is. And from a utilitarian point of view, you want a penalty that combines the minimum of actual suffering with the maximum of deterrent effect. And so compared to a long prison sentence, execution's much better, which is fine if you had robots do the executions. But if you bring capital punishment into a criminal justice system, that's going to change the nature of your judges, your prosecutors, your governors. Yeah. And about the death qualified jury?
No.
So states that have the death penalty run into the problem that there are jurors who are scrupulous about shedding blood and therefore will not bring in a guilty verdict in a capital case. Right. And so the courts have decided that at the voir dire, at the jury selection, the jurors can be asked whether they are scrupulous about that and excused if they are. Well, it turns out that what's called a death qualified jury is much more likely to convict.
Yeah.
Because the people who were scrupulous about shedding blood were the people who were going to give, benefit of doubt in the first place.
Right.
So it turns out somebody accused of a capital crime is much more likely to be convicted of it because you've torqued the system. So that's.
But so at all levels, so if you think about the incentives for using it as a revenue device or the just unwillingness, even incapacity of the system to impose these very harsh penalties means that you have to think about this active engagement between an official system and the individual.
So the low-cost punishment, it can be a bug as well as a feature.
Right. Yeah. or like low probability punishment can actually be a feature that's kind of built in.
And
so I've been negligent in watching the time. So
we run over. Okay.
Well, yes, but we can, if there are cards or any questions that people want to bring forward, we'll start taking questions from the audience.
Who's collecting cards?
Can somebody just bring the cards up? That's it. But I guess while we're waiting for the cards, one thing I've thought about is, have you ever applied this kind of reasoning to something like the teaching and testing and the whole debate about bringing accountability testing to the educational system?
Well, I certainly thought about this in a management context. And it seems to me a lot of this applies to worrying about whether people are being honest on their expense accounts, or if you're managing a Medicaid program, managing the fraud aspect of it. Mm-hmm. The teaching thing, I think, is a different set of issues. Mm-hmm. My view about No Child Left Behind is that Edward Deming is spinning in his grave. Right? No Child Left Behind is a perfect application of Taylorite scientific management from about 1912. And it's as if we'd learned nothing about statistical QA and continuous process improvement. Yeah. It's everything wrong, right? It's based on fear by the employees, and Deming's first rule is cast out fear. Mm-hmm. It's based on an occasional high-stakes event rather than continuous monitoring. It's based on census testing rather than sampling. Mm-hmm. What?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could comp stat education by giving every kid a laptop, having them do all the assignments on the laptop, and having those scored in a way. And then the principal calls the third grade teacher in and says, Johnny Smith's reading scores plateaued 3 weeks ago. Are you on that?
Right.
Not, oh, your students didn't do well last year, we're firing you. Yeah. And it's hard to believe that apparently intelligent people designed a system that was so inconsistent with everything we know about management.
Yeah, yeah.
I should point out, we do have one big urban public service that isn't perfect by any means, but has been massively reformed over the last 50 years, and that's policing.
Yeah.
Policing had a lot of low-grade, not very good, sometimes corrupt and brutal employees in it. It had ferociously powerful and obscurantist unions in it.
Yep.
And we fixed it without firing the employees or going after the unions. We fixed it by figuring out a way to get the whole organization devoted to crime control, and all the other problems went away. No police department has been fixed the way Eli Broad and Bill Gates want to fix school systems by firing bad employees. Yeah.
By the way, you quoted something to me, I think, about the key to reducing crime was just getting people to do their jobs. Did I get that from you? Or, yeah. So who was, and was that something you relayed from Kelling? Or
No. It's that. At least here's what I've said about that, which is there's a lot of attention paid in the criminology literature to whether a particular kind of intervention will work to change offender behavior. I claim we already know that, the answer to that question. The hard question is whether you can actually get that intervention applied.
Yeah.
So the hard problem is not the offender management problem, it's the public management problem. If you can get the officials to do the right thing, the offenders will absolutely do the right thing. And one of the things that Hawkins is working on is, so you've got a probation department, You want to know whether every violation is being reported. There's a natural tendency to backslide on that. Well, can we develop software that will tell us whether a violation was acted on? There's simple stuff. For example, if a positive drug test, is not hard to figure out there's a positive drug test. If somebody simply didn't show up for an appointment, the only way to know that is to look at the probation officer's own files. Well, that's not true in a medical office. When I go to see my doctor, the first person I see is the person at the desk who has a list of appointments and checks me off and says, take a seat.
Yeah.
Right? Put that person in and then check the no-shows again, right? So figuring out how to bring the swift, certain fairness to the official side is going to be a hard
So I may have gotten this from somebody else, but the gist of it was, some brief encounter where someone came to him or her and said, I figured out how to solve the crime problem. What you have to do is get people to do their jobs. And then
I see.
And
that was not me, but yes.
Okay, but in some sense, there's some real truth in that, because but it's not a trivial thing to get people to do their jobs. But if you define the job correctly and then get people to do it.
So first you have to define the job correctly, right? I mean, most probation officers, well, in many places, most of the probation officers are fairly high quality people doing their job the best they know how. And you really need to redefine what the job is. And then get people to do it.
Good. Okay. Well, let's just go to a couple of these questions. So one is, would you say that the shift towards broken windows policing was the key to the drop in crime here? I think what that means is you're free to define broken windows policing to be anything you want to define it to be, and then answer whether you think it was the key or not.
So broken windows turns out to be a complicated idea, or at least it turns out to be three different ideas under the same label. The original broken windows metaphor is simple. If there's a house and one of the windows is broken and the window does not get fixed, the neighborhood kids will break all the windows in that house, right? If something looks unowned and uncontrolled, it will be the locus of bad behavior. And so this is just an idea about order maintenance. If you do some order maintenance, you will get order. So that's the first idea. Second idea is when you talk to people who are afraid of crime and you ask them what they're afraid of, they frequently name things that aren't crimes. The gang of kids hanging out on the street corner yelling insults, right? So it turns out that fear is generated as much by disorder as it is by crime. And therefore, if you do order maintenance stuff, you can improve the level of order without actually inflicting a lot of punishment, because people will get the message. And there won't be the example of other disorder for people to follow. And doing that will make people feel safer, even if it doesn't change the actual crime rate. The extreme broken windows claim that I think George Kelling believes, that I don't think Jim Wilson believed, and that I don't much believe. There's one piece of experimental evidence, but then it turned out that experiment was a fake, is that if you reduce disorderly conditions, you will reduce real crime, serious crime, because offenders use disorder as a signal of where a place is being unpoliced. And therefore that if you can, get the litter off the street, well, it's a little hard to believe. Anybody who grew up in the East, as I did, where even rich neighborhoods are filthy, and moved to California where even poor neighborhoods are pristine. What counts as a threatening level of disorder is going to vary. I don't think we have evidence for the strong broken windows claim. Lots of evidence for the 2-week broken windows claim, and that's plenty of reason to do what Ray Kelly did in his first incarnation as commissioner, which is crack down on squeegee operators, right? Cracking down on turnstile jumpers. That stuff was all worth doing because it reduced the feeling of a place out of control. The other thing, and so this is a different kind of broken windows claim. Turned out when they started arresting turnstile jumpers, robberies went down. Partly because a lot of those guys had guns. And once they started being arrested, they stopped carrying guns. So there's a third idea, which
and
gets you
many
to
of them-
stop and frisk.
And many of them had outstanding warrants for their arrest. It was a good way to
Right.
catch people who
So this is what gets you into stop and frisk. The notion is, if you can figure out some reason to have a police interaction with somebody with a high probability of being a knucklehead,
Yeah.
you can reduce crime. And I think we've seen both the efficacy of that and the high cost of that.
So at least on the way you're characterizing broken windows, yes or no, that was the key to bringing crime down in New York?
No, the key to bringing crime down, well, I think in fact the key to bringing crime down in New York and elsewhere was getting lead out of gasoline in the mid-'70s.
Okay.
I'm very persuaded that
Okay, we're going to have to save that one.
that's a big piece of
I'm
it.
totally unpersuaded on this one, but you and I will have to.
We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah.
But the
I mean,
policing change.
Well, let me tell you, but the way we're going to decide this one is the same way we're going to decide the abortion one, is we're going to look at the data and figure out, is this a cohort effect or is this a time effect? And with lead, it's going to be more smoothed out over time, but I think it's going to turn out to be another time effect as opposed to a cohort effect.
It is a time effect, but there is clearly a cohort piece of it. And the other thing is, on an international basis, you look when lead was reduced in gasoline, and you get the same crime reduction, the same gap. And if you look at individuals, lead exposure predicts crime. And if you look at neighborhoods, what were the high lead neighborhoods, the biggest crime drops? There's too much here. But in any case,
if we were talking about the miracle of the fall in crime and the dramatic improvement of our educational system and educational outcomes, I'd be with you. But I'm not sold.
So look, the key thing that was done to bring crime down in New York on the criminal justice side was the decision that reducing crime was the goal of the police department. Once you'd done that, everything else fell into place.
Well, the belief that the police could actually make a difference, and then a decision to act on that.
Right, because once you did that, you could get people to do their jobs because the police knew what they were doing. And that was the key move. And now the key move is to get institutional corrections, community corrections, and prosecution all to think of themselves as crime control agencies and start asking the question, how is what I'm just about to do going to reduce crime?
To define exactly what they're trying to accomplish, and then start to measure, is it working? Are the things we're experimenting with working? And just to try and get through a few more of these questions. Several are about the story here in New York. Let me ask another one. So how important and why is it for the police to repair the relationship with the question says black community, but presumably the minority community more generally here in New York City? And then how can they repair that relationship?
It's only everything.
Yeah.
And the answer is respect and consistency. And treating arrest as a cost and not a benefit. I mean, I think part of what happened was the CompStat process started to count field interrogations as output. Well, you get what you measure. I think that work is now well underway. But it's going to require a lot of listening. And part of what's happening, this is already happening in NYPD, is years ago, I did some ride-alongs in New York and LA, and this was the old unreformed LAPD. What I noticed, just as a sort of casual observer, was that LA cops were more polite to people they were putting cuffs on than New York City cops were to citizens who were making complaints about crime. It's the, can you tell me the way to Grant's Tomb, or should I just go fuck myself problem. And it's deep in the New York culture, and it's deep in the NYPD culture. And teaching police to arrest politely and to interrogate politely is going to be a long job, and the department has now started on it. And that, plus just reducing the number of actual arrests, I think can go a long way. But the other thing is, the neighborhoods that have the worst relationships with the police still have a serious crime problem. And part of the bad relationship with the police is that the neighborhoods feel both besieged by the cops and underserved.
Right.
And so doing smart things to get a handle on their crime problem is part, not all, but part of the job of building a relationship. But at some point, you got to sit down.
Yep.
And the hard part from the police point of view is that means you have to spend some time being yelled at.
And I know that
this is the stuff that David Kennedy's good at.
Yeah, but also, you know, somebody like George Kelling, you know, right now is talking about some of these basics, like whether officers make eye contact with people, and that the kind of felt presence in the neighborhood that can vary depending on things like eye contact or a little bit of conversation.
The other thing is the cameras. Having every camera on every tie clip.
Yep.
It makes an enormous difference, and it reduces both true and false complaints of police abuse.
Right.
You know, conscience just has been defined as the still small voice that tells you somebody might be watching.
Right. Right.
So the cameras are. I mean, there's a lot of information technology stuff.
Yeah. But again, to go back, this is the same thing. I think we're gonna face the same issue that we faced about the stoplight cameras, which is that those could be used in ways that could be incredibly beneficial. You know, like a police commissioner or a precinct commander who really wants officers to be polite. You don't have any way to reward somebody for being polite because you don't know if they're doing it. So it could be very beneficial. But there's a sort of a genuine anxiety about exactly how this technology is going to be used. If it goes the way of the stoplight cameras, maybe we want to just strangle it in the crib, you know, before it gets going.
I am convinced that having a video record of every official citizen interaction, you know, ought to be recorded as a constitutional principle. And one of the reasons I was so happy to support Obama for president in 2008 was that was his big legislative accomplishment in Illinois. Was a law requiring that all interrogations be taped. And guess what? Complaints about brutality just fell through the floor.
Let me take another question here. So how important do you think changes in the built environment, like hardening targets or changing the physical space, are as a crime reduction strategy?
Creating defensible space that looks like it's owned, I think is probably a good idea. Hardening targets is a terrible idea in my view. I mean, look, New York, most of the cost of crime comes not from actual victimization, which is a relatively rare event. So here's my other calculation. Take all those burglary losses, multiply by the number of burglaries, divide by the number of households, divide by 12. So now I have an expected burglary loss per household per month that's comparable to a rent number. From the political heat around burglary, you'd think that number was in the hundreds, at least in the tens. Actual number is 4, right? That's the rounding error in your electric bill.
So $4 per month.
$4 per household per month is the cost of burglary. So that's all I can save by hardening the targets.
Yeah.
And the cost of doing that in terms of people's fear is overwhelming. So no, I think we need to encourage people to take a peace dividend. Look, I'm just old enough to remember when a middle-class kid growing up in Baltimore could take 2 buses to the stadium, changing buses at Park Circle, which is the corner in the Wire.
Okay.
And take those same 2 buses back at midnight. I was 13, 14, right?
Yep.
And nobody thought that was odd.
Right.
That was a normal thing to do in 1964.
Right.
No middle class growing up in the city has the freedom I had.
Right.
And I think those are the big costs.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out a way to recompense the victims of crime in a way that encourages people to take more risks of being victimized. Because the goal is to drive down avoidance costs, not victimization costs.
Well, you and I are both old enough to remember what it was like before the great crime wave and what it was like to be a kid, preteen kid, take buses around the city and so forth. And you know, it's encouraging.
This latest case where a woman was arrested for child neglect for letting her 9-year-old play in the park. What? At 9, I was walking to school.
Yeah.
Uphill both ways.
But we can remember what it was like in those low crime days. Fortunately, we're really getting back.
Well, but here's the problem.
But yeah,
we're getting back to those victimization rates.
Right.
But after people took lots of precaution, the actual criminal riskiness to the environment, and therefore the actual cost of crime, isn't really back to 1965 levels.
That's right. And simultaneously, we have these enormous costs associated with the incarceration rates. So that we're kind of part way to kind of closing this arc that gets us back to the environment that we grew up in as kids, but we're only part of the way there, and the real challenge is how do we get that fear, get those precautions down, and avoid this punitive and expensive incarceration.
To get back to 1965 incarceration rates, we have to let out 80% of the prisoners. And my view is we can do that if what we're letting them out onto is a fairly tight regime, which ought to start tighter even than a tight parole regime, and then generally loosen up. So,
and you can
my label for this is training wheels for freedom.
Yeah, you can see how this could go with information technology, but to kind of close, the fear is that if we go down the path of the stoplight cameras again, the whole possibility is going to get wrecked.
Right. And we really do need to wage a massive war on the use of the criminal justice system as a revenue mechanism, right? I mean, apparently the town of Ferguson is supported largely by fines on its black residents.
Well, I think it's like a quarter of their budget, but still, it's the marginal thing they can adjust, and so good. Well,
all right.
On that note,
Thanks much. Thanks everybody.
Thank you for coming.